My name is Siphiwe Baleka. I am the coordinator for the 8th Pan-African Congress Part 1, which will be held later this year in Harare, Zimbabwe, called by Her Excellency Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao. So as we are building momentum, organizing, getting input from Pan-Africanists and from the African diaspora, the 6th region, I decided that I would try to have conversations with various members of the African diaspora and Pan-Africanists about the agenda for the 8th Pan-African Congress Part 1, current issues, get to know people as part of building a really broad support for this historic moment where we have been invited by the African Union, which is 55 nation states in Africa. We have been invited through Article 3Q to the African Union Constitution to be part of the building of the Africa that we want, to be formally included in the decision-making and governing of the continent through Article 3Q, which invites and encourages the African diaspora. Now, this has evolved into the 6th region, and that's what we're going to discuss tonight. And I see that Reverend Kwame Kamau is now joining us. So I'm so excited. My understanding is Reverend Kwame Kamau has earned the title of the African Reparations Minister. So Reverend Kwame, I'm just kind of introducing tonight what we're doing. Welcome. I'm glad you were able to spend this time with me. We are recording, so this is our first personal conversation. So it's very genuine, it's very warm. I've been in some forums and I've heard you speak, which prompted me to reach out to you and say, hey, Reverend, listen, we should have a conversation. You are dynamic, you're saying all these things about reparations, repatriation, Pan-Africanism. So welcome. Please introduce yourself. Let's start out by just talking about a little bit about who you are and what you're doing.
Well, first of all, before I get into the meat of who I am, and hopefully when I say meat, there isn't a connotation of flesh. I'm a vegan. That's just a little joke there to start us off. I want to say thank you to you for extending the platform and the invitation. Certainly, it's a pleasure and privilege to be here. You are indeed a brother from another mother. And perhaps one can claim that a brother from the same mother, if we are identifying the mother as the continent of Africa. You are quite right. African Reparations Minister. Growing up, I'll tell a little story to explain why. Growing up, I was always asked a question: what do you want to be, when you grow up? And I could never respond with any singular answer. Not because I didn't have talents and gifts and opportunities aplenty. First degree black belt, operating in the culture and art space, music, dance, drama, things of that nature. Certainly operating from a place and perspective where I am very diverse, let's say so, in terms of my offering. I couldn't land on any one. And so I pursued several tracks, including education, environmentalism, empowerment of communities, including village councils and community councils, operating within the sphere of esotericism, as a reverend, not only within the Christian fraternity, but recognized as an elder within other religious and spiritual frameworks as well. Certainly operating within international diplomacy and exchange, as well as a number of other areas, inclusive of but not limited to economics and entrepreneurship. I recognized very early in life that no one of the hats that I would wear, whether on a Monday or Tuesday, was the type of hat that I wanted to wear for the rest of the week, which is to say, I love all of them and I couldn't settle on one. And so, from that perspective, when I began my Pan African work as a third generation Garveyite and the son of certainly a Black Power revolutionary in Trinidad and Tobago, Baba Nana and Kamau, it was such a wonderful hand in glove. I can finally use all of my opportunities, finally use now all of my competencies and skills to be a benefit and blessing to my people. And I later discovered that that was providential, because the decimation, the scattering, the trauma, the genocide, and certainly the ethnocide that we have experienced is a multi-dimensional, multi-generational, interdisciplinary approach to eviscerating the culture, the soul, the spirit of the African. And so it is going to take a multidisciplinary, multi-dimensional, and yes, multi-generational approach for the recovery process. And that's one of the things that endears me to you, my beloved brother, the fact that I know that you wear many hats as well and sit on many organizations pretty much as I do. You get around, to put it that way. And so it's really just an opportunity and a tremendous privilege to be here. And I'm hoping that at the end of the process, you and I, based on a greater overstanding, to use Rastafari terminology, of each other and the work that we do, can perhaps walk more closely hand in hand towards the delivery of reparations, repatriation, and African redevelopment. I'll land there for now.
So we're going to get into some of those issues. But before we do that, you know, you mentioned Rastafari. You may know that I spent a lot of time in the Rastafari movement. And I want you to know, I actually came as a guest of the Rastafari community in Trinidad and Tobago in 2006. And I spent time in Faizabad, in the bush, cutting bamboo, making bamboo, you know, structures to stay in, and furniture. And so I've had an experience with the Rastafari community in Trinidad and Tobago, specifically in Faizabad. And if it's at all possible, if you can find some way to get me some doubles and roti here in Guinea-Bissau, okay, I will pay you handsomely for that, because I will never forget. That was some good, very good food. So I just wanted to let you know I've been to Trinidad and Tobago, and I assume that's where you are right now.
Yes, it is indeed where I am right now, and yes, we have a very diverse offering of ethnicities in our nation, our Twin Isles state. East Indian are the number one ethnic group by percentage of population, closely followed by Africans, and then followed by mixed groups. And you have, of course, your Syrian Lebanese group, you have your Chinese population, you have your local white population, and of course, you have others as well within the melting pot that is Trinidad and Tobago. And so the cuisine kind of reflects that. Roti and doubles, you know, is a combination of flavors and spices,
yes,
from the West and from the East, and, you know, everything coming together. And so there can be beauty in diversity if it's coming together in a place of equity. And that's the problem. It's apart from our amazing and wonderful cuisine, there usually isn't the kind of equity and inclusiveness of the African in the diaspora, and in some instances even on the continent, as we would like. But such is the reason why you and I were born, so that we can be change agents to bring about new life and new love.
Well, since you brought up this issue of the diverse cultures and the ethnicities in Trinidad and Tobago, let's kind of start the discussion there, because one of the agenda items for the 8th Pan-African Congress is the definition of the diaspora, which raises the fundamental question about identity. In Trinidad and Tobago, how do the Black people in Trinidad and Tobago identify themselves? Do they consider themselves first and foremost Trinidadians? Do they consider themselves Africans, African Trinidadians? Do they acknowledge, are they even aware of maybe their actual ancestry groups? Like here in America, a lot of people are taking DNA testing and finding out. Where is Trinidad and Tobago, the Black community in Trinidad and Tobago, when it comes to the identity issue?
That's a powerful question. And if I am to be frank, and I love being frank, it really depends on the African that you speak to. Unfortunately, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a mixed bag. So there is an ultra progressive Pan-African movement in Trinidad and Tobago. As a matter of fact, while we are a small nation, Trinidad and Tobago has and continue to punch above its weight class. As an island, we can fit into the continent of Africa perhaps 1,000,000 times, any one of the nations over 1,000 times easily, because we are really, really tiny, republic nation of again, Twin Isles. But that didn't stop us from giving birth to Henry Sylvester Williams, the first Pan-Africanist to call a Pan-African conference in England in 1900. That didn't stop us from producing C.L.R. James, noteworthy scholar with regards to all things Pan-African. That didn't prevent us from producing Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, my namesake in that regard. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it is because of Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture, that I enjoy the name that I have now. My parents were under that inspiration. We had our very own 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago, dealing with, at the time, the neo-colonial constructs in Trinidad and Tobago that tried to say to us, no more Mother Africa, no more Mother India, only Mother Trinidad and Tobago. And so we do have a very progressive African community, Pan-African community. My grandfather was a Garveyite. My father was a Garveyite and a Black Power revolutionary, participating in the 1970 Black Power Revolution. And so that revolutionary thread runs very, very deep in Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, going back to the year 1900 with Henry Sylvester Williams and the calling of this Pan-African Conference. But there are also those who go by the appellation or term Negro or Creole in Trinidad and Tobago, or go by the term Trinidadian, because they don't want to be identified with Africa, choosing instead the new identity of Trinidadian because they see themselves not through the Pan-African lens, but rather through the narrower national lens in that perspective. Especially within and among your professional class, your middle class, they tend, for the sake of being more agreeable, for the sake of being more employable, for the sake of fitting in within the cosmopolitan group, they tend to not want to stick out by way of, an identification with Mother Africa and a revolutionary spirit. They see that as perhaps potentially an undermining of their political, social, and economic fortunes, being labeled a radical and a revolutionary. And it's sad to think that even identifying as African can be deemed by some, not all, as a revolutionary act and a radical act. because the very same persons who will say, I'm a Creole, I'm a Negro, I'm a Trinidadian, has no problem calling their brothers East Indian, or the Chinese man in the Chinese store, or the Syrian man in the Syrian Lebanese store. So, but when referring to oneself as African, it's seen as revolutionary and radical. So, Frantz Fanon and all of the great writers, Walter Rodney and all of the great writers, they are quite correct in their psychological assessment of the Negro in the 20th century at the time. Now we're in the 21st century, and there's much carryover in terms of that. Sad but true, but there's a growing, I have to admit, sense of Afrocentrism in Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension, the Caribbean. There's a re-emergence of African values and Pan-African values and vision. And certainly at the heart of that are groups like the Emancipation Support Committee, of which I am a part, the Caribbean Pan-African Network, of which I am a part, as well as other, Pan-African constructs who are paving the way for the beginning of a new birth, a new generation, a new type of Caribbean Pan-Africanism that enjoys the best of both worlds, where you can be scholarly and can be operating within the society from a professional perspective, and still enjoy your Pan-African hat without reservation. And so, I'm just really happy to be a part of these constructs as we continue to push the Pan-African agenda forward.
Now, here in the I'm in Guinea-Bissau, but in the United States, we have witnessed this phenomenon where the Pan-African, the Afrocentric movement we've witnessed this phenomenon where, because of the new technology that allows us to do DNA testing, we witnessed this phenomenon of people wanting to know where they come from, specifically in Africa, and once they find out, actually going to the ancestral homeland, to the actual place that their maternal or paternal ancestor was actually kidnapped and trafficked from. So we see two parallel kind of growing movements. This movement to what we call lineage restoration, where people are using the technology to make that ancestral connection. And then a new sort of Blaxit movement, where first of all, 800,000 people have taken the African ancestry DNA test. We're coming up to 1 million. And then we're seeing this movement where all these people are leaving the United States and going to various countries in Africa. My question to you is to what extent has these two phenomenon reached Trinidad and Tobago? Is there interest in that reconnecting their ancestral lineage? And how much of the population is seriously interested in actually returning to their ancestral homeland?
And that's a brilliant question, and I'll answer it in two ways. One, the very same Rastafari community of which you spoke, and your Pfizer experience, they, from the very beginning, that is the Rastafari community, have always been repatriation, reparation, and African redevelopment minded. It was part of their mantra, it was part of their call, it was part of their ethos and their pathos and their logos from the very beginning. And so we are, from the perspective of the African Rastafari community in Trinidad and Tobago, operating from an African-minded, back to Africa, let's repatriate movement perspective for some decades now. That's not a new phenomenon. Of course, with the advent of the Black Power Revolution in the 1950s and 60s, into the lead up, of course, of the 1970 explosion that became the very overt revolution, in some cases by arms, in some cases by way of peaceful protests, in some cases by way of academic pursuits and protests. Just a very diverse, offering in terms of revolutionary modalities, to coin that phraseology. But for all intents and purposes, now that we are in the 21st century, there are those who are interested in the very specific haplotype, genetic marker, the male, the female mitochondrial DNA. There are those who are interested in that. But by and large, we have a Pan-African thrust that isn't so concerned about the specific tribe, but is more concerned about, in many instances, the state of the Pan-African continental and diasporan experience, such that beyond the tribal identity, not that the tribal identity is necessarily negative or bad or in any way backward, no, absolutely not. But beyond the tribal identity, more often than not, when I speak to Trinidadians and when I speak to people up and down the Caribbean, they are more concerned about the holistic Pan-African identity that goes beyond the tribal. Why? They have witnessed and they have seen tribal and ethnic conflicts, whether in Rwanda or whether it's the xenophobia that is sometimes displayed in South Africa against Nigerians and other West Africans coming into South Africa to seek employment and better living. They see that kind of tribalism as negative. And they wish not in some circles to participate in that type of tribalism. And so one of the ways to do that is simply to identify as an African and to embrace all of the tribes, all of the ethnic groups in Africa, knowing full well that if we go far back enough, there is one African father, one African mother that we all come from. And so many of us gravitate more to that Pan-African identity rather than the individual tribal identity, though there are those who would pursue that and has pursued that. But while for you, or when I say you, the average American, those DNA tests are only, a few American dollars. For the Trinidadian, for the Guyanese, the Trinidadian is 7-1 in terms of the US dollar. The Guyanese, it's 200 Guyanese dollars to the US $1. So things that may be relatively easy to do in America, using American dollars and American technology, may not be so accessible, you see, to some Afro-Trinidadians or to some Afro-Guyanese or to some Afro-Caribbean people. And so again, technology barriers, financial barriers, and the very positive Pan-African identity really allows for them to identify more with the continent as a whole rather than any one specific ethnic group. In my experience, I leave room for other observers and commentators and academics to speak to it from their perspective. But in my perspective, that has been my experience.
Well, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on one aspect of the lineage restoration movement teaching, which has to do with African spirituality, the link with the ancestors. And what one of the principal concepts that is developing now is this understanding that those of us who are descendants of the prisoners of war that were taken in the Dum Diversis War, trafficked and enslaved in the Americas, the Caribbeans, in our entire lineage, there's a unique ancestor, the one that was born in their homeland, received the birth rights, the birth rituals, was the one that survived the Middle Passage and then died in captivity and never received the burial rights. Now, all the other ascendants after that, they were born in captivity. They never had the birthrights. They never had the burial rights. And the ones prior to the Middle Passage, you know, they were born there. They had the birthrights and the burial rights. So there's one unique ancestor in each of our lineages that has this interesting dilemma. If we are to fully embrace and internalize African spirituality and understand that there's a very real ancestral realm, just like we're living in this earthly realm right now, and that there are laws and principles that govern that realm, there are cause and effect mechanisms, that spirit, that one that received the birthright and never had the burial rights, is requiring someone in their bloodline, someone in their descent, to return that vital life force energy that is contained in the body, to return to the ancestral homeland so that it can put into effect a cause and effect mechanism that will do an internal reparations or an internal healing in the ancestral realm. I find this to be a very powerful and compelling argument to say that the current, you know, there's a need for someone in each of these families to return home. There's a spiritual need, and it has nothing to do with the individual in their earthly body now. So, for example, me returning to Guinea-Bissau had less to do with me as Siphiwe Baleka, and it had more to do with my fifth-generation great-grandfather, Brasa and Chabra, who was kidnapped as an 8-year-old child from his homeland in his Tabanka, his village, Nunche, here in Guinea-Bissau. And when he was put in chains and put on that boat, his last thought as he was seeing his homeland recede and he's experiencing this trauma and this terror was, if I could just jump overboard and swim back home. And when he arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, he had the same prayer. If I could just find some way to return back home. That restless spirit is now starting to speak in this generation, causing people to have this compulsion, if I would call it, to return home. So this is, it's a new kind of understanding, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Sure, and it's a beautiful thought. It's very poignant, for sure. Let me speak to it this way. In Trinidad and Tobago, there's a very strong, very, very powerful Yoruba community here. And so while on the one hand, there are many Trinidadians who don't know who they are and where they come from in terms of the specific tribe, nonetheless, there's a very strong Yoruba presence in Trinidad and Tobago. And the veneration of the Orishas is part and parcel of our spiritual cultural menu. As a matter of fact, to survive, they hid some of their Orishas in the veneer of Catholic saints, and they adopted certain Catholic nomenclature and name identities for their Orishas for the purpose of survival. And when, of course, they were able to practice free and without what we would call, those impediments, many opted to get rid of, those Catholic veneers, so to speak, and to pursue a more authentic, Ile Ife experience in terms of spirituality. Now, why did I say that? For those that engage that practice, there has been attempts at returning, of course, to the motherland, to the Yoruba people, originally called the Yariba people, originally called, even before Yariba, which was a name used by the Hausa and the Fulani to describe them. They call themselves as a people group the Evevio. There has been many an attempt, as it were, to return to Yoruba land and to, as it were, not only engage in that right of return for the sake of the individual pride and the individual benefit, but also that of their, their ancestry, their very proud African Yoruba ancestry. So that exists. That exists. However, there are those of us in the diaspora who are very aware of, again, the ethnic identity and the spirituality that comes with each ethnic group. But again, looking through the lens of the Pan-African construct, are pursuing a more universal African approach to spirituality, which is to say that for me, especially as an Ubuntu practitioner, Ubuntu being the foremost African philosophy for the better part of 300,000 years, we are looking at more universal constructs and universal, as it were, ways of life, including spirituality, that can allow for us to identify beyond the tribe with that of the entire people group. Looking at what was created in the Nile Valley civilization, first by the Kushites, and then by way of the formation of what we call Kemet, the Black Land, the land of the Black people. We saw that in the creation of Kush, in the creation of Kemet, there was this cosmopolitan Pan-African approach to the Medu Neter, the lingua franca at the time, as well as speaking through iconography, a language that all of the Africans, regardless as to tribe and ethnicity, can see and observe and follow. And again, the creation of a spiritual system in Ma'at, truth, justice, righteousness, reciprocity, balance, harmony, and order, again, that transcends the tribal spirituality, looking now at a Pan-African spirituality, and very importantly, Pan-African code of conduct, moral code, ethical code. And so for many of us in the diaspora, while we are very proud to be Yoruba, or very proud to be Igbo, or very proud to be Akan, or very proud to be Hausa, or very proud to be identifying with that ethnic group, we are looking for, some of us, that greater overarching connecting identity and construct. And for many of us, we find that in Ubuntu, I am because you are therefore I am. And we find that within the spirituality of Ma'at, and the moral code that it advances and provides for us. And so by way of that more universal identity, many of us see nothing at all lacking or missing, because we are going back to a construct that is more ancient and more, as it were, universal in construct. So it includes the tribal. The tribal does not necessarily include the universal, but the universal always includes the tribal. And so we are not against those who pursue the tribal. We congratulate them and we support them for doing so. But there are many of us who are pursuing a more universal approach to Pan-African religious, spiritual, and philosophical, cultural identity. And by way of Ubuntu and by way of Ma'at, and what Ma'at teaches and makes available through this universal moral code, there is much satisfaction there. And many of us find that being sufficient to allow our ancestors through us and the blood lineage and the DNA which is alive, the life of the flesh is in the blood, And so we being alive now, we possess our ancestors through our bloodstream. And so by way of the practice of these universal traditions and rights and moral codes and ethical frameworks, we see that the circle is now complete, not returning necessarily and always to the one identity, but returning to the universal identity and seeing the beauty of that, and seeing again the Pan-African construct that allows us so that we can more easily communicate with one another, more easily trade with one another, more easily repair one another, more easily support one another because of this more universal approach that we can find there.
I'm glad you used the repair. We're halfway through our session. We're gonna have to maybe dedicate some time to talk more about the internal reparations, the internal repair, because again, the concept of repair is to return to the condition before the damage. And that condition was, the fact of the matter is, and I don't think these are exclusive, that, you know, pursuing the universal constructs so that we can unite and perform our historical imperative. But at the same time, you know, if we're going to, especially you're the African reparations minister, so you understand the idea that before the damage, before the crime was committed, and that crime was committed on an individual who was part of a family, who lived in a specific territory, practiced a specific culture, spoke a specific language, had a specific spirituality. So purely theoretical, if we were talking about full repair, all of that would be restored. Meaning, you would, for example, I would say Kumama and Sumanda, Abala Werte and Bo. I'm actually speaking the language of my fifth generation great-grandfather. I'm not speaking Swahili, which is kind of being promoted as a universal language. The reason why I'm saying this is important, and while we're Pan-Africanists and we understand the value of that universal construct, from a scientific and a spiritual point of view, getting into what we call epigenetics and how environment and experience are encoded in the DNA. The matrix for encoding the DNA is the electromagnetic signature of the place where the experience took place, and then the language. So knowing that as a genetic scientist, if we want to unlock some of the, you know, our genetic knowledge and endowment that goes back to, you know, you mentioned Kush, but pre-Kemetic, pre-Kushite times, we can unlock that simply by returning to the areas that have the electromagnetic signature, hearing the language that most of your epigenetic encoding took place in, and even consuming the environment. So for example, here in Guinea-Bissau, we have a fruit, it's called faroba. We have another fruit, it's called veludo. So for 6 generations, I was cut off from that. When I returned to Guinea-Bissau and I started consuming that, something in my DNA said, hey, wait a minute. I remember this vibration. I haven't had it for 6 generations. And so things begin to activate. And that process, it's a process that's governed by laws and principles, cause and effect. So in order to have it, say you're Bamileke from Cameroon, but you decide you want to go visit Zanzibar, which is all well and good. But in doing that, you're missing out on some of these things that require you to actually go to where that ancestor that I spoke of. So in another opportunity, we can have a conversation and get deep into that. But what I want to do now is shift gears a little bit. And for example, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say African Union 6th Region?
Unfinished business.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Talk more about that.
Well, the reality of the African Union, and we are thankful for the construct coming out of the OAU, His Imperial Majesty Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, and all of these great Pan-Africanists coming together. The original pursuit, of course, was one United States of Africa. However, there were saboteurs even then, and there were agents even then, and there were provocateurs even then, who were on, about the business of anarchy and separation and division as agents of the divide. Unfortunately, they were in greater number. They won out in terms of the process, and we decided to continue as a construct that has a quasi unity, but not a single federal national status. Of course, that emerged into, of course, the formation of the African Union. And in the African Union, we have North, South, West, East, and Central African regions having a headquarters, enjoying, as it were, not just observer status, but full rights of participation within, of course, the African Union, as well as all of the economic, political, social, and other benefits and perks that comes with such full entitlement. Unfortunately, while we are named by way of a quasi status, the floating sixth region, there is no headquarters. There are no permanent ambassadors. There is no economic and social, as it were, budgetary allocation for our people. And so it's very much unfinished business. And so we would not be able ever to fully feel or experience that union that is the African Union, unless that is repaired, unless that is dealt with, unless that unfinished business is finally and completely brought to a place of satisfaction. And we are not there yet. We've been knocking on the door for quite a while as a region. But what I have found is that there are two great impediments to that happening. On the one hand, at the level of the continental, there are still agents today that do not see or desire for the sixth region to enjoy all of the rights of the other five. And then within the sixth region itself, the diaspora, because the civil society construct is a pelau, it's a kalalu, it's a popopori, it's a mismatch, it's a hodgepodge, it's a miscellany, it's several groupings coming together, not one voice, not one identity, not one cause, not one purpose, not one people. In that state of division as a sixth region, there's nothing that we can really achieve within that state that can really speak to anything that is power or productivity or progressiveness. So my prayer, and more than a prayer, my work as an African reparations minister, is to work on both sides of the Ethiopian Ocean, for some the Atlantic Ocean, which is to work with the monarchs and to work with the state and to work with the civil societies on the African continent, such that they would understand that until and unless the sixth region is fully incorporated, the African Union and the African experience in general is not complete. And many of them are fully aware of that, and they are supporting that effort by way of their time and talent and treasure. And I salute them and I thank them for it with regards to their knowledge of the need for the sixth region to be fully incorporated. but also on the side of the diaspora. I'm doing much work there together with my colleagues to share with them and to say to them, yes, our individual groupings are awesome. They are amazing. Even as it were, before the Maangamizi, before the Maafa took place, we were strong individual tribes and states and territories as individuals. But because we lacked a Pan-African construct, because we lacked a single military, a single economy, a single culture, and yes, a single spirituality, some of us saw each other as foreign or as rivals, and we made bargains with the Dutch against the French, and bargains with the Spanish against the Portuguese, and the Portuguese against the British, fighting these individual wars, thinking that somehow because of our extreme talent and our giftedness that was enough. But slowly we were eroded into becoming the chattel, the prisoners of war. That was, of course, the aftermath of what you described before, Dom de Vassas, in terms of this war declared on us. So while they were approaching us as a collective, we were fighting as individuals, and there's no way you can win that war. A finger will always be crushed by a fist, and that was our experience. Bring it forward to the 21st century, we still fight as fingers in the diaspora, trying to compete for attention and resources, whether at the UN level, whether at the level of the OAS, whether at the level of the CARICOM, and so until we have that unity as a diaspora, we will not achieve the goal, which is that full restoration, that full inclusion.
Well said. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I'm so thankful that we've been able to start this conversation. I think that what you just described is really the lesson of a mature modern day Pan-Africanism, which says, look, if we tell the truth of what happened, how this people on the continent and this people on the continent and this people, although on one level we have this same origins, we go far enough back in history, we have all these different diverse cultures, right? But the lesson is we allowed those differences, right, to cause us to have these conflicts that allowed us, when at a certain time in history, when we needed to defend our common interests, we failed. And so now a mature modern Pan-Africanism is, let's tell the truth. Let's tell the truth about the relationship between, for example, Mandinka and Balanto. Tell the truth, say the result of it is that both Balanta and Mandinka, some were trafficked across the Ethiopian Sea, right, and ended up in slavery, while those that remained behind suffered colonialism. So the lesson is we don't have to become homogeneous, meaning we all have to decide on one religion. We all have to decide. No, we can still have our various ancestral cultures and identities, but we have learned the lesson that if we allow the differences, the fact that I vibrate green and you vibrate yellow and she vibrates red, which is all just superficial. If we allow that to dominate and cause conflict amongst us, then we haven't learned the lesson of Pan-Africanism. So we just have to tell the truth and say, because we fought each other, this is what happened to those that were captured, and this is what happened to those that remained on the continent. Now we have the opportunity to fix it. Now, having said that, because of you use the analogy, the fingers fighting each other. and there's so many different topics and items and agendas that we could talk about. Her Excellency, Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao, had realized that unlike the previous Pan-African Congresses that dealt with a very, very broad range of issues, that this time we would deal with a very limited agenda on a few things that, one, there was the possibility that despite our various differences, we could all agree on. For example, I think we can all agree that if you are an African in the diaspora, you should be able to be a citizen of the African continent. You should, right, especially if you are the descendant of those that were forcibly taken, never renounced your birthright, never relinquished your domicile, right? I think that even if you don't want to go back to Africa, I think we can all agree that morality, justice, the right thing to do is to reconnect those and at least provide for citizenship. So there's a very limited agenda so that we can try to move the needle and formally establishing the 6th region on equal par with the 5 regions. Now, there are some that believe that that is a waste of time because that's a kind of reformist type endeavor for an organization that has proved itself to be defunct and is a club of neocolonial leaders that are not serving the people. I'm not saying everyone involved in the African Union or its member states fits that description. I'm glad that you thanked and appreciate those who really do support incorporating the AU 6th region and are doing it with, not just their words, but their actions, their commitment. But that's one end of the Pan-African spectrum that says we can move through this gradual process to try to reach this goal of unity. And then there are those, for example, maybe represented by the Pan-African Federalist movement, that is a more radical, revolutionary, we need an alternative to the current status quo in the African Union. And sort of our concluding 5 minutes, how do you see that, sort of, those two ends of the spectrum, and talk about that?
Sure. It's a powerful question. And you leave it for last, that we would call that in cricket terms, googly, okay. With regards to what you've just described perfectly, by the way, I can understand both sides of the spectrum. Progress has been extremely slow, molasses slow, for those who are familiar with molasses. It's been molasses slow at the OAU, and it still continues to be molasses slow at the AU. That's a fact. That we find ourselves in 2023 with unfinished business in terms of a headquarters and citizenship and having permanent ambassadors and having access to finance and resources so that we can come of age and politically self-actualize as a diaspora is indeed a crying shame. Let's not mince words. That is an abysmal reality that we should not find ourselves in the 21st century, but it is our reality. The however is that with regards to those who are going in the next direction and what they are offering and what they are proposing in terms of the alternative, the question that would have to be asked to that group, and I understand them and I sympathize with them, through which singular mechanism, machinery, and tool are you going to advance that cause? Are you speaking to militarism? I think not. There are extreme European and Asian and American interests in the African continent, and they're not going to sit by while anyone engages militarism on the continent in pursuit of Black power. So the military strategy is really dead out of the waters before one can even complete the thought, because there are several interests who will pounce upon you in defense of their colonial interests that still remain in Africa. So that's really not really tenable. If you're looking at a political pursuit, by way, of course, perhaps maybe creating political parties on the continent of Africa, as has been created, I will not mention any names, and then utilize those political parties as a means and as a vehicle to make your way into the political power structure, by way of becoming a president and having, of course, a cabinet, and then taking your individual nation, whether in West, East, North, South, or Central, to the AU, and of course, forcing change and transformation by way of that process. While those political parties do exist, they are not supported by the majority populations in the nations where they do exist. So these political parties exist, but they don't have the popular vote and the popular support, because in some instances, the indigenous African people are not quite acquainted with that style of politics coming from, in some cases, diasporan leadership. It's like the devil you know versus the devil you don't, and in some cases, hate to use that terminology, but they choose to stick with the political, normalcy, that which they are accustomed to, and they tend to progress in that manner. So the political organizations in Africa seeking to find ascendancy, representing that style of politics, they aren't doing too well. A third option would be, well, you go to the United Nations or some international group, and you try to eke out for yourself, an existence within the international community, that would allow you a status that everyone has to recognize, whether in Africa or outside of Africa. Everyone has to recognize your status because it's coming from a large, powerful construct, the UN, the ICC, the ICJ, etc. The problem with that, again, is that we don't have a single or a homogeneous or a monolith, and so it's which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So I see merit in the approach that you are engaging. It is a low-hanging fruit. It is not something that requires a heavy lift to be done. It's simple enough to be achievable. It's a SMART goal. It's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's realistic, and it's definitely time-bound. And I think that progressive steps, even small steps, are better than no steps at all, and certainly better than retrograde movement going back.
Reverend Kwame Kamau, this has been a great pleasure. You have I very much respect your ability to put together a historical perspective with astute insight into current events, while maintaining a very high level of sensibility to all the components involved in an issue or a question, and having a discourse that is respectful to all engaged. That is, in this day and age, it's kind of rare to have all of that. So as your comrade, as your brother, I want to just, tell you that how much I appreciate and respect your contribution as a Pan-Africanist, and the way that you are going about educating, mobilizing, activating, and solving problems. Not just talking, but solving problems. And as you know, the way to do that, the way you solve problems is by the relationships you have with people and getting people to work together. And I think you have a great gift for that. And I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation to come and kind of talk about these issues. There's a lot more that we can discuss, but our hour is up. And I do believe you have another speaking engagement right after this. So I want to be respectful of your time, but trust, I will extend another invitation to talk about some other issues. And in one final minute, if there's anything you wanted to address in this kind of final minute.
Sure. It would be, of course, to express thank you to you, the host, for the invitation extended. It would also go on to identify that those people who are on that journey, that Sankofa journey to reconnect, that lineage restoration exercise, I want to say to all of you that I respect that exercise. To those of you who have been battling on the front line, of course, of the repatriation movement, the reparations movement, and the redevelopment movement, I know that the struggle has been long and hard, and sometimes the resources have been few and in between, and sometimes not at all. And there have been many a temptation to give up and throw in the towel. But I say to you, hold the line. I say to you, we can't do this without you. I say to you that each one is required to teach one. And there are unique things that you bring to the table, even in your disagreement sometimes, that is necessary in order for the entirety of the story to be told and the entirety of the reparations to be achieved. In that regard, I stand as your brother, as your comrade, as your supporter. At any point in time that I'm needed, at any point in time that I'm required, please feel free to call upon me. I am your very, very humble servant. And yes, while I am looking at the origin of the Embo people, the cradle, the embryo of the African civilization, and while I absolutely love the universal, and that's where I find my greatest joy and comfort and solace, certainly I respect those who want to do that microscopic deep dive. And I'm with you in that regard. But for me, it would be a trajectory towards the universal rather than being the goal and the end in itself.
Yes.
So with that said, I stop there. And again, I thank you for this amazing opportunity. One looking at us can think that perhaps we are brothers, maybe just maybe ambulanta like you and I, we definitely share some genetic commonalities there for sure. But for all intents and purposes, keep on doing the great work that you're doing, and I'm here for it every day and twice on Sundays.
Thank you, Reverend Kwame Kamau. This has been the 8th Pan-African Congress Part 1 Conversations, and we're going to have more with other great brothers and sisters who are our comrades that are engaged in this work, passionately committed, because our ancestors have paved the way for us. So thank you so much.